Hey, fellow coder, welcome back to this series called FreshVotes, where we're building a real-world Java web application from scratch, mostly leveraging Spring technology. So, in the last episode, we created the register post endpoint, or rather register endpoint with a post mapping, if you will. And what we did not do is persist our user. So when we try to create a user account, it comes into this method, but then it doesn't actually do anything other than print out the user in Java object format that came from the front end, that came from HTML. So we're translating HTML fields into a Java object, which is great, but then we need to do something with that Java object. So let's do something. Instead of doing a system out, let's actually persist it to the database. Now, typically what you would do here, the good way of doing this is to separate your back-end structure, your server-side stuff, into three different layers. The controller layer, which we have in front of us, the service layer, which is the layer that should do some sort of, well, service, provide some sort of service, provide some sort of functionality, business logic, that kind of thing. And then we should have a database layer, a repository layer, a DAO, data access object layer, whatever you want to call it. So those are the three layers. We have the controller. So let's create a service. Let's create a login service. Well, this is almost like a user service at this point, because what we're going to be doing is creating or persisting a user to the database. So let's create a user service, because I feel like that feels a little better. So we already have a service package. Let's go ahead and say new class. We'll call this the user service. And let's not forget immediately to annotate it with the service annotation, which is what Spring needs, the Spring framework needs to identify this as an actual Spring component or object that will be brought into the Spring context, application context. So import the service annotation from Spring, and then we can go forward and create a method that will save our user object to the database. So this will be a public method. It will return a user object, because typically when you save a user object, you should typically return the saved instance. That's just sort of good practice. Not mandatory, but good practice. So, and we'll call this save. And we can say save just blatantly and broadly say save because it's within the user service. So when you say user service save, it kind of implies that we're saving a user, especially because we'll be passing in a user object. Okay, so that is why we're going to do that. That is why we're going to call it that. Because calling it, save user is a bit redundant because obviously this is saving a user, right? Okay. So we'll call it save, and then it's not happy because it needs to return a user, right? So right now we'll say return null, just to make it happy. And what should this service do? Well, it should, like I said, save the user to the database. And really, beyond that, there's not much that it needs to do. So this is a bit of a strange scenario whereby the service is just really calling a repository, and the repository will do the heavy lifting and then return an object, and then the service will just take that object and return it back to the controller. So actually our service here is not doing very much, but that's okay, because we want to separate our concerns. We want to separate the controller from the service from the repositories. Having said the word repository, we need to have some sort of repository to use for our user to save it. Thankfully, we've already created a user repository. I'll refresh your memory to show you what it looks like. It's an interface, called it user repository, extends JPA repository. So this JPA repository is Spring data, which is why it comes from Spring framework.data package. This is Spring data. And what this does is it vastly reduces the amount of boilerplate code you need to write in order to do the typical CRUD operations with Java objects and databases. So I'll show you what I mean by that. So I'm going to bring in the user repository. This is actually a Spring managed object, even though it's not annotated with repository. I could. I'll do that for the sake of argument, but you don't actually need to for whatever reason. Spring will pick this up. Probably because it extends JPA repository, and because JPA repository is a Spring object it assumes that this is probably a Spring managed component. In any case, this is optional in my opinion, but I'll do it anyway. So, okay, the user repository will bring in, we will auto wire the user repository into the user service. Okay, Control-Shift-O to import our two things here, the auto-wired annotation and the user repository object or interface. And we'll call it user repo. You can call it user repository. You can call it whatever you like. I just call it user repo because I'm lazy and I like to call things repos. So this should, the auto-wired annotation should automatically create or assign the previously created user repository into the user service so that we can actually use this object inside of our save method. So in other words, I can say return. Well, I won't do return. I'll do user repo dot, and look at all this beautiful stuff, all this code that we can now invoke if we like. So there's a whole bunch of saves, save all, save and flush. There's find by stuff, find by username, find by one, or find one, find by ID, find all, you know, blah, blah, blah. There's a whole bunch of methods we can call, and that's all because, as I said previously, we are leveraging Spring data. That's what Spring data brings all these boilerplate things in so that we can make use of them. So we can just say user repo.save, and what that wants is it wants an entity, right? And the entity in this case is user, because the user is defined, if you look at the user class, it's defined as an entity, right? That's what it wants. It wants an entity, so we'll pass it an entity. And then that's almost it, right? You just say .save user and it should save the user. Now, I say almost it because it actually returns a user object. This, when you say .save, it returns a user object. So I could say user equals, right? So I can take this user pass that's coming in and set it equal to what's being returned from the user repository, and then I can say return that user, right? Or to make this even simpler, I can just say return user repo.save, right? Because user repo.save will return a user object, which is what's being returned here, which is what this method wants to have returned, so it all compiles and is happy. So it's a very simple method. I know it seems a bit strange that you need to have this sort of one-line method, but like I said, it's a good idea to separate the service type stuff from the controller code. Okay, so this way you just need to say, you know, user service.save, which means you need to bring in the user service. So we'll auto wire in the user service that we had created. We'll import Control-Shift-O to import those two things, and now we can say user in the register post method, user service.save user, and the user is the one that's coming in from the front end. This is the one coming in from the HTML code. So we save that user, and then we redirect to the registration page. You'll note, though, that from the user service, we're not actually making use of the returned value because we don't really need to make use of it. I could assign, you know, I could make this a new variable. I call this the saved user, and then we can do a system out and compare the non-saved user with the saved user, right? So maybe we'll do that. We'll say non-saved user is the user, and then the saved user is the saved user. Okay, so we can do that, and that way it should illustrate to you the differences between the two, of which there should really only be one difference. Now, I'm realizing there's more that we need to do here, and it's actually a good thing I've created a service to do this, but I'll get there in a moment. One thing at a time. So let's go ahead and run the code. I'm going to have some scotch. My throat is sore, and my excuse is scotch helps. So I'm having some scotch. All right. Localhost 8080. Login is where we have the create account button. Let's click that create account button. Name is, let's do someone else. Let's do John Doe, right? And this will be, you know, john.doe at, I don't know, test.com or something like that. Oh, that's right. We need to still do the password and confirm password logic. Maybe we'll do that in the next video. So now when I hit create account, do I have it? Yeah, it's running in debug mode. So it should hit that breakpoint when I say create account. Boom, boom, boom. So now we're going to come in here with our user, and we're going to hit the user service.save. And let me clear my log, and you'll see in the console log down here, hopefully you'll see an insert statement if all goes well. I'll hit F6 to go over, and there it is, hibernate, insert into users, blah. So it actually saved our user that we had passed in. Now let's look at the difference between the user that we passed in and the user that was saved. Okay, hopefully did this. I made a mistake in my code in that I think I guess it won't show a difference. Shoot. So these will both show the same thing. It's I was hoping that I would be able to illustrate the difference, but it actually modified. I can see that this is red, this code, when I hover over the user, this is red because it changed. So previously the ID was null, and, well, authorities didn't change, but ID was null, although authorities might have been null as well. So that's why it says it changed, because now it's just an empty array. But anyway, the ID changed. So now the saved user, as you can see, the saved user hasn't changed. Everything's black, because that's just how it is. But this one changed. So unfortunately, the console log will show the same thing, though they will look identical. But the point I was getting at is when the user came in initially, the ID was null, and the authorities, I believe, were also null. And then an ID was assigned to it once it was saved, because that's what Hibernate does. Hibernate saw that user had a null value for an ID, and when an object has a null value for the ID field, and you pass it into a save method, Hibernate knows to perform an insert, because the ID is null, therefore it doesn't exist yet, therefore it needs to insert. If we were to invoke this save again with the same user, the user now does have an ID. The ID is not null, so Hibernate will then just perform an update statement on that user. Okay? Anyway, let's go ahead and hit play, and it'll redirect us, well, back to the registration page, because that's what our current code is doing. Now, I realized there's a few more things that we need to do here. The first thing is, if we look at our database, we'll see that there is a user in there now called John Doe. But look, the password is not encrypted. Bad programmers. So we need to encrypt that password. So it's a good thing we have a service to save a user. Now we can do the business logic to encrypt the password there. And one more thing, we did not create an authority, a role to go along with this user. So hey, good thing we have a user service save method, right, where we can do all this stuff. So let's go back into our save method. Let me stop the server. Go back into the save method, and let's do this stuff, right? So let's encrypt the password. How do we do that? Well, we've already... do we have access to the bcrypt? Yeah, it's right here. We defined the bcrypt, the password encoder, as a bean in a configuration class. So because it's defined as a bean in a configuration class, that means it will be accessible on the Spring application context, which means we can auto-wire it in. How do we do that? Well, the same way we do everything else with respect to auto-wiring. We could say auto-wired, private, what was the type again? Password encoder? Yeah, password encoder is the type. And then we can call it password encoder. And that should auto-wire the password encoder into the user service such that we can actually use it. So now we can say password encoder dot encode user dot get password. And that will return, I'll do Control-2L to automatically generate this code. People often ask me after the fact what I did to get, or with the shortcut keys that I do, because I do them so quickly. If you are at the beginning of a statement that returns something that can be assigned to like a variable, you could say Control-2, and that brings up a little menu down here, a quick assist menu, where you can assign it to a field, local variable, extract a method, or rename it in the file. I do Control-2 plus L will assign to a local variable. Boom. So that way it creates string encode. Now, I don't like the word encode. We'll need to say, encoded password. So So now we can take this encoded password and we can do something with it. Well, what I want to do is I want to set the password equal to the encoded password. That's what we want to save into our database, right? So there you go. It's going to encode the password and then save it into the database. But we also want to create the roles, right? So how the heck do we do that? Well, the roles come from, what is it, authority? Where is security? Security, authority. So this is an entity, authority, that has the string authority, which really this is just a role that we that we want to create. And it has a foreign key mapping back to a user. So we want to create an authority and assign it to this user. Okay, because we already have this user, so we want to assign an authority to it. So we want to essentially say user dot, well, you might be tempted to say set authorities, right? And then pass in a collection, this being a set of authorities, into it. But the sort of the better way to do it, in my opinion, is to say get authorities dot add a single authority. Okay, so you get the existing collection of authorities. In this case, it's a set of authorities. So you get the set of authorities and just add to it. Okay, and what we're adding to it is going to be a new authority that I'm going to define right here. So new authority. Okay, again, Control 2L, boom, it generated this lines of code right here, these lines of code, or lines, these, whatever. It generated this code. And then we can populate this authority with whatever it is that we need. So the authority, again, I know it's a bad naming convention, authority.setAuthority, but this is a string, this is really just a role. So the role we want to set here is role user, because remember, we want this to be a user that is being created. And authority.set user, right? Which is going to be the user that we're about to save. Cool? Good. Now we can say user.getAuthorities because this is a bidirectional relationship, which means the authority points to the user and the user points to the authorities. So we need to set both sides of this equation. This is one side of the equation. This is the other side. The other side is we take this authority and paste it in right here. Okay, so that should be everything because we don't need to, the other setter that we have here, the other setter that we have here is set ID. We never set IDs manually, we let the database handle that for us. That's why we use the generated, where is it, for the ID, that's why we use generated value of identity. Okay, that will automatically create the ID for us, so we don't need to manually set it ourselves. So yeah, that should be everything that we need to do in order to properly create a user. So let's go ahead and delete that user from our database manually, the one that we have here, John Doe. So I'm going to hit, where's my minus, delete selected row, and apply, finish, select star from users, boom, he's gone. Cool. Let's go back in and say John Doe again. John.doe at test. Create account. Ooh, I might want to let's put a breakpoint in here to see what's going on. Create account. It didn't go in there. Why didn't it go in there? Did I mess something up? Did I mess up the... No, the CSRF is there. This is what happened last time. It didn't do anything because the CSRF wasn't properly populated. That's weird. I don't know why that didn't go in. Let's go to register again. Force a refresh. It could just be a refresh issue, but who knows? I also could be completely wrong, and there is a real issue here. Create account. Yeah, now it goes in. It's just a weird rebooting. Maybe some previously cached stuff was there. Who knows? That's why I always... reset the server and then do a hard refresh on the page whenever I'm dealing with strange bugs to eliminate that as a potential problem. So, okay, I'm in the register post method. I'm going to hit F6 to go into here because I have another breakpoint. And now we can see what happens with this password encoder. So the user's password is ASDF, and you see the ID is null. Okay, all new authorities is blank, but anyway. I thought that was going to be null as well, but turns out it's just blank. In any case, the ID is null and the password is not encoded. So now we're going to encode the password and assign it to the variable called encoded password. So now encoded password is this long monstrosity of a string. There you go. And we're going to take that encoded password and we're going to set it into the user's password. So the password will change from ASDF to that long monstrosity, right? So there we go. We've set that the user has an encoded password in there now. Fantastic. Then we're going to generate an authority. Currently, the authority has nothing inside of it until we set the role and the user into it. So now the authority has a role and a user. And then we'll take the user.getAuthorities, which currently has none, and we will add that authority that we just created. Boom. Okay, so that authorities list now has that authority object that we previously created. And then when we say save, hopefully if all goes well, we will see 2 inserts. Fantastic. One insert into a user's and one insert into authority, which is what we wanted. And then we will go forward and, oh, right, so this text is probably useless because we need to, yeah, they both return the same thing twice. So I just need to get rid of those system outs. I've already shown you that the user ID was null and now it's populated with a value and the authorities was blank and now it has a value. So clearly something worked. Cool, fantastic. So let's go ahead and delete those system outs because they're useless. And we are in business. We've now created, let me confirm, we've created a user, John Doe, with an encoded password and a matching authority as a role user, which means that I should have probably redirected to the login screen now, is really what we should have it do. So this should just redirect to login instead. And now we can log in with john.doe@test.com with the appropriate password, say login, and voila, we have logged into our dashboard. So without having to do any manual tinkering with the database, other than deleting a user, without having to do any manual tinkering, we have created a user account, or we've created a flow for any old user to be able to go in and create their own account and be able to log in with it. Cool? Cool. So, hope you enjoyed this video. In the next one, we'll probably start to focus on making this stuff pretty. I think that's a good segue into what we need to do next, which is make it pretty, and then we can take that knowledge that we gain from learning how to make the login screen and account creation screen pretty, and we will take that knowledge forward with us into the rest of the development of this application. Cool? Hope you enjoyed it. Take care of yourself. Can't wait to see you in the Can't wait to see you in the next video. Happy learning. Bye for now.